It's an atlas unlike many others, an atlas that traces the historic paths over land, sea, and ice that Inuit have taken over hundreds of years. Joining us now, one of the creators of this work in Halifax, Nova Scotia via Skype, Claudio Aporta. He is creator of the interactive Pan Inuit Trails Atlas and a professor of marine affairs at Dalhousie University. And Claudio, it's good to have you on TVO tonight. How are you?
Good, thank you very much.
First question's pretty obvious. I'm wondering what a guy who's originally from Argentina, why he's so interested in Canada's north.
That's a good question. I came to Canada to study anthropology in 1997. I was interested in anthropology of technology at the University of Alberta. I found some really interesting researchers that shared their fascination with the Arctic. Went to the Arctic for the first time in '98, and I kind of fell in love with the place and with the people.
The place and the people. What did you love about the place? Let's start there.
Well, if you have never been to the Arctic, it's a shame, but it just, you get off the plane and you just sense that vastness, that immensity in the landscape, the clarity of the sky, the purity of the air. It's just a very special place, and it changes so much from season to season.
And the people?
Well, the people are just unique. You know, it was, for me, coming actually from Argentina to Canada, it was a huge a cultural shock. It was a culture like like none other culture I had ever seen. So it was just an incredible experience for me.
Okay, Claudio, let's get the particulars on your atlas, and we should just explain right off the top here that this is not like a Rand McNally atlas like we used to use in high school back in the day. This is a different kind of atlas, not a book. Why don't you explain what it actually is?
Yes, so this atlas is the result of a research project that I conducted with Michael Bravo at the University of Cambridge and Fraser Taylor at Carleton University. And basically what this atlas shows is the history of use of the Inuit Arctic, of the Canadian Arctic, and particularly Northwest Passage, through place names and trails that were documented in historical sources in the 19th and early 20th century.
But this is not a book, it's online, right?
This is online, so basically this could be seen as a compilation of different data sources. So what you will see on this atlas is maps that were drawn by Inuit or by explorers with the help of the Inuit, and are located physically in different books, archives, and libraries all over the world.
And if you're not an explorer from 100 years ago, but rather an explorer of things online today, what kinds of things could you explore by using this atlas?
Well, you could see the significance of mobility, for instance. You can basically, just by looking at the trails on this atlas, for instance, you can go using these traditional trails all the way from Greenland to Alaska. And you can certainly make connections between the trails that people used 200 years ago and the trails that people are using today.
So let's try now to understand what you have tried to achieve with your atlas.
We looked at maps of the Canadian North, the Canadian Arctic, and even at Google Earth images of the Arctic, and you always have that sense of an empty place. And in fact, that idea of the Arctic as empty and vast, it's quite remarkable and quite common in people's understanding of the Arctic. So we wanted to put some life into that map. We wanted to show how intensively used the Arctic was, and the marine areas actually of the Arctic are and have been used by Inuit people.
Well, we just saw some pictures showing the numbers and the lines, of course, which you have superimposed to indicate where the trails are. How did you find out that information?
Well, those trails and place names specifically were digitized and georeferenced from historical maps. So this is maps that Inuit hunters made for British or Canadian or American explorers or that the explorers themselves drew with information provided by Inuit. And those are just a very small sample of all the place names and trails that exist in the Arctic.
Now, one of the things, if people saw there, your map has trails which go from land to water and back to land.
Yeah.
So how do you know? How do you know? There's no landmarks on water, so how do you know?
Well, that's an interesting question, and the answer is connected to how Inuit understand the ocean. The sea ice that we have usually seen non-Inuits have really perceived as an obstacle for navigation. For Inuit, is something completely different. For Inuit, the sea ice is an extension of the territory, so it basically attaches to the shores, and it stays there for up to 8 months in some places. So the sea ice itself has a topography that happens every year more or less on the same location. So Inuit do see and remember and know features on the sea ice, and they can obviously lay out their trails following those features.
Would the ice terrain, though, not change year over year over year?
Well, it does change, but the general patterns don't. So you will mostly, every year you will have the ice ridges and the ice leads and the open water polynyas located approximately on the same areas. So that people can actually remember having even born on the sea ice in places that they even name.
Okay, what do the trails tell us about how Inuit hunters lived on the terrain?
What trails basically tell you is how important mobility was and still is for Inuit people. I mean, Inuit were they moved to permanent settlements in the 50s and 60s, but before that they moved, they were semi-nomadic. And even today, traveling is very important for them. So what the trails tell you is that they didn't travel randomly in the Arctic. They actually follow precise layouts and in precise times of the year after year. And these trails that actually are ephemeral in the sense that they are, sled trails are basically broken on fresh snow, and then they disappear after snowfall when the snow melts. But the routes themselves are actually permanent, so they have been used for centuries.
Okay, they've been used for centuries, so would the Inuit of today, for example, be using maps as you have created them in order to find these trails, or is there some oral history as well that they're following?
Well, the Inuit approach to the land is mostly oral. It's what I would call an oral geography, oral geographic knowledge. So every Inuit hunter would have, they would say that they have a GPS in their heads. They would have a huge amount of information, thousands of kilometers of trails, for instance, engraved in their memories. Nowadays, people do use cartographic maps and even GPS units, but the traditional wayfinding techniques didn't make use of paper maps at all.
And just to clarify, the maps that you have identified, those trails, those lines, they're still in use today by Inuit communities today, is that right?
Yes, yes. In fact, as I mentioned before, those trails are just a sample of the trails that people use today. I have documented Inuit trails from the communities, in several communities of the north, using also GPS units to follow hunters on the trails, but also through mapping sessions. And again, I have documented many hundreds of trails that are used every year.
Many hundreds, okay. Well, let me ask you this then, and this is a more political question. You know, of course, that the government of Canada is very eager to fortify its claims to the north with the other countries that have interests up there as well. And I'm wondering whether you think the work that you are doing is helping Canada to fortify its claims to the north.
It's a good question. I don't think that it's necessarily helping Canada. I think that eventually it could help Canadian claims on sovereignty without being an expert on the legal issues. At the same time, it seems to me that the Canadian government is more interested on the kind of British/Canadian history, post-colonial history, really, of Canada, than on this really extremely important historical evidence of Inuit use of the Canadian Arctic in a very systematic manner for centuries.
I wonder whether you think climate change and the impact that it is having on Canada's north will also have an impact on these trails as you've identified them.
Yeah, it is already having an impact. Communities all around Nunavut are telling us that the sea ice is less reliable today. It forms later, it breaks earlier, and it's more dangerous. So what this is provoking is basically a change in the layouts of some trails, at least, so that people have to take very long detours to go to the same destination. And this has economic impacts because people use snowmobiles and they have to use a lot of fuel, basically, to take those detours.
Well, you've anticipated my next question, which was if the north continues to warm and tourism becomes a bigger part of the north of Canada, can you imagine people using your atlas and the trails on it as a kind of, for lack of a better expression, adventure tourism?
Well, it's all possible. I think that, first of all, I think that there's still very little understanding of the use, the significance of the use of marine areas by Inuit, simply because we don't have a sense of history in the ocean. The fact that people can have, place names in the ocean and a historical past and a cultural history connected to the ocean, something we need to still, to discuss and to come to realize. There is potential for conflict also in terms of, ice breaking and the opening of shipping routes that might intersect with areas that are really important for Inuit. The entrance of the Northwest Passage, for instance, the Lancaster Sound, is being used by Inuit for centuries.
Have you had any feedback from members of the Inuit community as to whether or not they like what you've done?
Yes, all the feedback that I've had so far has been very positive. I think there is a sense of what geographers would call counter-mapping, is reclaiming some of this space through the production of maps. When Europeans, British explorers came to the Arctic, they named the land, Baffin Island and Prince Edward Island, etc., as a way of claiming the land. And they knew that those places had names, they had been named by Inuit, but they mostly ignored those really important elements of Inuit history. And I think that Inuit are, not only my work, but the work that has been done by many other people and institutions, they're basically trying to reclaim those spaces.
Given the work that you've done on this, Claudio, I should just finally ask you, you're the map guy. Do you think maybe you want to just put your own name on there, the Claudio Aporta Pass or something like that?
Well, some friends in Iqaluit, where I did most of my research in the Eastern Canadian Arctic, they already named a little lake, Claudio's Lake. Although they told me about it years ago, and unfortunately I didn't put it on the map.
It's good of you to join us on TVO tonight. The Associate Professor in Marine Affairs at Dalhousie University, Claudio Aporta. Muchas gracias.
De nada.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.